Dear friends, greetings from Catholic University in Washington. It's a pleasure to be with you at St. Mary's Seminary and School of Theology in Cleveland. First of all, by means of this pre-recorded video, but then I hope live for some discussion and interaction. And I thank Father Joseph Hilinski for the kind invitation. This, as you know, is the week of prayer for Christian unity, and Father Hilinski asked me to speak on Catholic Orthodox relations and the quest for Christian unity. I'm very happy to do so. I've been a member of the International Catholic Orthodox Theological Dialogue since 2005, and a member also of the North American Orthodox Catholic Theological Consultation since 2006. And a lot of good things have been happening in Catholic Orthodox dialogue in recent years. But both of those dialogues are, of course, sadly postponed at the moment. We're all acutely aware of the crisis that's gripping the whole world at the moment. The pandemic is brutally exposing the fragility of human life and of so much of the daily routine that we used to take absolutely for granted. So many casualties, so many deaths, even of people young and fit. So many people are anxious and wondering where to turn. Their normal certainties have been completely shattered. Yes, life is fragile. Being created out of nothing, we have life only as a gift. And it's vital, literally vital, that we cling to the giver of that gift in order to survive. The great Eastern saint Athanasius puts it perfectly in the Office of Readings that we've had just in recent days. God brought creation into existence by his own eternal word, he says, and he did not abandon it lest it return to nothing. If creation was not protected by the word, who is truly from the Father, he goes on, it would relapse into non-existence. Well, we see the true meaning, do we not, of the great feast that Christians East and West have just been celebrating, Christmas, when the Word became flesh. God himself, the giver of all life, comes among us as Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, to be our lifeline, the way, the truth, and the life. And that lifeline is especially offered to us in the Eucharist. Jesus says in chapter 6 of St. John's Gospel, as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats me will live because of me. You see the idea of the lifeline from the Father through the Son, Jesus coming among us, and then to us in and through the gift of his body and blood to us. One of the most important developments in recent decades in both Catholic and Orthodox theology has been a growing understanding that the Eucharist truly is the heart of the Church. The Church is a Holy Communion, renewed by receiving Holy Communion from God himself, who from all eternity is the Holy Communion of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, the Blessed Trinity. Life is communion with God, and communion is life. The Eucharist makes the Church, that's the motto, of what is often called Eucharistic ecclesiology. And that vision of the Church as primarily a Eucharistic community, a Eucharistic communion, has been the framework for Catholic Orthodox dialogue ever since it formally began in 1980. Now, there isn't time to tell the whole story here, but I'd like to sketch the course that the dialogue has taken, and I'd particularly like to discuss where we are now. Catholics and Orthodox, as I'm sure you know, accept one another's orders and sacraments. There is true apostolic succession on both sides, and that means that in the dialogue between us, we're free from many of the thorny issues about sacraments and ministries that arise when we're dealing with Protestant churches. But Catholics and Orthodox have their own thorny issue, namely the papacy, universal primacy. What is it for, and how should it be exercised? That was really the issue that led to the terrible split between us of 1054, often called the Great Schism, that split which tragically has not yet been healed. But with so much in common, we surely have great resources to tackle that issue, perhaps coming at it afresh in our own time. Here's the $64,000 question, you might say. If we now agree that the Eucharist makes the Church, can the papacy be seen as a service to the Eucharist? Might that be the way forward? Well, having prepared the ground with dialogue and documents over the past 40 years or so, the papacy is what Catholics and Orthodox are now directly dealing with in our dialogue. And we're looking at the first millennium, when at least in principle, we were united for guidance. To help situate things, I hope that you have the handout with significant dates and events and quotes. The title is simply Ecumenical Movement, and it looks at that broad story over the last 100 years or so. And the story of Catholic Orthodox dialogue is woven into that bigger story. And I hope that handout might be a useful overview for you and a handy reference in various contexts. And I hasten to say that we're certainly not going to go through it line by line here and now. We're simply going to dip into it, as it were. And I hope you can see on the chart that if you turn to the second page and look down to the bottom, the latest statement from the Catholic Orthodox dialogue, and C/O is the little symbol for Catholic Orthodox documents on that chart. The most recent statement from the international dialogue was agreed at Chieti in Italy in 2016, and it has the title Synodality and Primacy During the First Millennium, towards a common understanding in service to the unity of the Church. Towards a common understanding in service to the unity of the Church. And the title is pretty self-explanatory. Perhaps you're already aware of the document. It's quite short, and you can easily Google the title or simply Google the phrase Chieti document. And I do urge you to read it during this week of prayer and to pray that Catholics and Orthodox may be able at last to resolve this difficult issue between us. Because the present pandemic really makes us realize yet again that our division and all Christian division is a scandal. The world urgently needs to hear about Christ, our only true hope, who offers us life, who offers us communion. As Vatican II said, division between Christians, the lack of communion between us ourselves, openly contradicts the will of Christ, scandalizes the world, and damages that most holy cause, the preaching of the gospel. The world urgently needs Catholics and Orthodox and all Christians to stand together as one in proclaiming Christ himself, the good news to our world. Let's dive into our story. Some years ago, an Orthodox student drew my attention to an apostolic letter written in 1894 by Pope Leo XIII on the reunion of Christendom. It was called Praeclara Gratulationis. Pope Leo was particularly wanting reunion between the Eastern churches and the Catholic Church, and he spoke with great warmth about the Eastern churches. I quote, "The principal subject of contention," he said, "is the primacy of the Roman pontiff." And he urged the East, and I quote again, to return to that one holy faith which has been handed down to both of us from time immemorial. Before the man-made division between us, he said, the East, like the West, agreed without hesitation in its obedience to the Pontiff of Rome as the legitimate successor of St. Peter, and therefore the Vicar of Christ here on earth. End of quote. Well, I'm afraid that's not an accurate reading of history. More accurate is what the Chieti document says, namely that in the first millennium, while the Bishop of Rome was certainly held in honor in the East did not actually see him as the successor of Peter, the first of the apostles, and he did not exercise canonical authority over the churches of the East. Moreover, the title Vicar of Christ for the Bishop of Rome was not even adopted in the West until around 1200 by Pope Innocent III. So you see, despite his very best intentions, those statements of Pope Leo in 1894 were very skewed historically. And it's not really surprising, therefore, that his call at that point to the East bore little fruit. The Patriarch of Constantinople at that time said in a letter of his own in 1895 that he hesitated to respond to Pope Leo's letter because, and I quote, "it was unprofitable to speak to the ears of those who do not hear." Well, in recent years, the international dialogue has been making great efforts to listen very carefully to one another and to portray history accurately. And that's one of the reasons why it actually took 9 years and 3 attempts to reach that Chieti document in 2016, after the groundbreaking Ravenna document, which you may also have heard of, and it's there on the chart, next to the date 2007, the Ravenna document on ecclesial communion, conciliarity, and authority. We met in 2010 in Vienna, and then in 2014 in Amman, Jordan. But on both of those occasions, we failed to agree a text. We finally succeeded in Chieti, third time lucky, you might say. And the Chieti document very significantly said, and I quote, "It is necessary to reflect upon history. God reveals himself in history. It's particularly important," said the Chieti document, "to undertake together a theological reading of the history of the Church's liturgy, spirituality, institutions, and canons, which always have a theological dimension." You may recall that Pope Leo urged the Eastern churches to return to that one holy faith which has been handed down to both of us. In other words, he took it that the East had broken away from the Catholic Church. Now, it's only fair to acknowledge the mirror image of that view that's often found among Orthodox. We're all tainted by this tendency to see history in a sort of self-favoring way. A few years ago, in an Orthodox church in Massachusetts, I picked up this leaflet with the title, as you see, "A Timeline of Church History, Tracing the Birth and Continuity of the Orthodox Church from Pentecost to the Present." Well, as you may be expecting, if you open up that little leaflet, there's a diagram that shows a straight line of continuity from Pentecost to the Orthodox Church today. And the Roman Catholic Church is shown branching off that straight line in 1054. In other words, from an Orthodox point of view, in the leaflet there, it seems that the Roman Patriarch, and I quote, in 1054 pulled away from the other patriarchs, pursuing his long-developed claim to a universal headship of the Church. So you see, from that point of view, it was the Catholics that broke away. As an Englishman, I must say I was particularly intrigued by the interpretation in the leaflet of what happened in 1066. As every English schoolboy knows, that was the date of the Norman Conquest, when the French invaded England. The monarchy, law, language, and architecture of England were changed forever by the Norman Conquest. According to the leaflet, however, there was another change, which I must say I had never heard mentioned before. 1066, it said in the timeline, Norman conquest of Britain, Orthodox hierarchs replaced by those loyal to Rome. Well, that was news to me. What about St. Augustine of Canterbury, sent from Rome to England by Pope Gregory already in 596? What about the Synod of Whitby in 664, which agreed to follow the Roman method for the dating of Easter? And so on. You get my point. We all do it, often without really thinking. And it's a huge obstacle to ecumenical progress, just reading history from our own rather biased point of view. Partisan history, by its very nature, will always divide us. But that's not the same as claiming that history itself must necessarily divide us. Secular examples like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the 1990s in South Africa show that healing can happen when both sides of a conflict face up to the realities of history together. It's not easy, but it is possible to go back and write history together. That's the way to what's often called a healing of memories. And the decision by Rome and Constantinople in 1965, if you have a look on the chart, 1965, the decision then to erase from memory the mutual excommunications of 1054, which so poisoned relations between West and East, is an outstanding example of such a healing of memories. Only love and a readiness to say sorry makes that sort of healing of memories possible. And I always think that the very first principle of ecumenism is where there's a will, there's a way. We have to be ready to forgive one another, to love one another, to draw a line under history and to move on, knowing that the fullness of truth lies ahead of us, not behind. At the Last Supper, Jesus said that the Holy Spirit will guide you into all the truth. We might say that ecumenism is wanting to make that journey into the fullness of truth together. Pope John Paul II once asked, and I quote, "Why did the Holy Spirit permit all these divisions in Christianity?" He acknowledged that part of the cause was human sin, but there's more to it than that, he said. We trust that God can bring good even out of evil. So, and I quote, he said, "Could it not be that these divisions have also been a path continually leading the church to discover the untold wealth contained in Christ's gospel and in the redemption accomplished in Christ? Perhaps," he said, "all this wealth would not have come to light otherwise." End of quote. It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? That perhaps the divisions in Christianity are caused not so much by a surfeit of sin, but rather by the sheer abundance of truth that finite human beings struggle to grasp and to hold together. Every Christian tradition treasures at least some aspects of the one truth, and each is really holding those gifts in trust on behalf of all of us, because they truly belong to all of us. All that God has given belongs to all of us. So even though we might appreciate the various separate conservation efforts that have taken place over the years, we can't therefore justify continuing division, said Pope John Paul. The time must come, he said, for the love that unites us to be manifested. And he thought that that time was now. And that's what the ecumenical movement of recent decades is all about, a blessed movement inspired by the Holy Spirit to try and overcome the divisions of the past. That's surely why, in his own famous encyclical letter on ecumenism, if you look on the chart, 1995, Ut Unum Sint, Pope John Paul's encyclical letter on ecumenism, he actually said that ecumenical dialogue is always an exchange of gifts, an exchange of gifts. It's a very famous phrase and a very beautiful one. Now, it's certainly true that Catholics and Orthodox have gifts to share, particularly with regard to synodality and primacy. In an important speech at Vatican II, Bishop Elias Zogby of the Melkite Greek Catholic Church, one of those Eastern Catholic churches, positioned, as it were, between Catholics and Orthodox, said that the Great Schism of 1054 had mutilated both sides, both Catholics and Orthodox. That was his word, mutilated. And I quote, "When it lost communion with the apostolic sees of the East, the Western Church lost the most collegial segment of the Episcopal College. Centralization was carried on at an extraordinary pace in the West, without anyone being able to hold it in check. On the other hand," he said, "the Eastern churches lost communion with the center of unity of the whole church, which is the Bishop of Rome. Excessive decentralization in the East, he said, had weakened the Eastern churches considerably, making difficult the regular practice of episcopal collegiality, which nevertheless, he said, remains their principal system of government. And what he then said is so like what Pope John Paul said 30 years later in his encyclical letter, that you almost wonder whether that day at the Second Vatican Council, the young Archbishop of Krakow was listening very intently to Zogby's speech in St. Peter's. Zogby said, "God draws good from evil." And he wanted this unhappy break between Catholics and Orthodox in East and West, rather, in 1054, to protect the Orthodox churches from centralization and Latinization, so that in the fullness of time, our dialogue would be immensely profitable and bring a great enrichment to the church when it is once again made one. Wonderful vision of what will happen when we come together again. We might say that it's as if the West has specialized in primacy over the years, and the East has specialized in collegiality or synodality. But those two things belong together, primacy and collegiality, primacy and synodality. So it's urgent that we bring them together and benefit from the riches of both sides as we do so. Let's see how the dialogue between us got underway and just glance at that historical chart again. The lifting of the anathemas on the 7th of December 1965 is noted on the chart if you look there. And just above it, what happened on the 5th of January 1964, when Pope Paul VI met Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. That historic encounter, and can you imagine a more poignant place for Christian leaders of divided churches to meet than on the Mount of Olives, where Jesus suffered and died for us? That historic encounter really inaugurated the modern push for reconciliation between Catholics and Orthodox after 900 years of separation. And regular prominent meetings of successive popes and ecumenical patriarchs have been a notable feature of Catholic Orthodox relations ever since. And they're noted on the chart if you look down through the years. The election of Pope Francis in 2013 had a galvanizing effect, not only on the Catholic Church and the world at large, but also on Catholic Orthodox dialogue. When Pope Francis first appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's after his election in 2013, he instantly sent some new signals about his ministry and office. He referred to himself not as the new Supreme Pontiff, but as the new Bishop of Rome. And he used St. Ignatius of Antioch's famous phrase from the very earliest patristic times, around 100 AD, when he referred to Rome as the church which presides in charity, implicitly understanding the church as a communion, not a pyramid. And 6 days later, for the very first time, a patriarch of Constantinople, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, attended the inauguration of a new Bishop of Rome, apparently because Patriarch Bartholomew had been so impressed with those very first words of the new Pope on the balcony of St. Peter's. The two leaders met again, and again it's in the chart of dates there, in May 2014 in Jerusalem, commemorating 50 years since the meeting there of Pope Paul and Patriarch Athenagoras. And then Pope Francis and Patriarch Bartholomew met yet again in November 2014, when Pope Francis visited Constantinople for the Feast of St. Andrew. In Constantinople, that's modern-day Istanbul, in Constantinople, Pope Francis made a most important statement, reiterating exactly some of the key decisions of Vatican II, which really reshaped the whole pattern of Catholic Orthodox relations. He said this, and I quote, "The restoration of full communion between us does not signify the submission of one to the other or assimilation." And then he said the following, very simply and very clearly, quote, "I want to assure each one of you here that in order to reach the desired goal of full unity, The Catholic Church does not intend to impose any conditions except that of the shared profession of faith. Further, I would add that we are ready to seek together, in light of scriptural teaching and the experience of the first millennium, the ways in which we can guarantee the needed unity of the Church in the present circumstances. The one thing that the Catholic Church desires, and that I seek as Bishop of Rome, the Church which presides in charity, is communion with the Orthodox churches. End of quote. What the Catholic Church and the Pope himself are seeking, therefore, is communion with the Orthodox churches, renewed communion, not jurisdiction over them. That needs to be emphasized again and again. That's what pertained in the first millennium, and the first millennium is our guide, as we've recognized for a long time. At that time, as the Chieti document says, the Bishop of Rome did not exercise canonical authority over the churches of the East. 1964 was indeed a breakthrough year for Catholic ecumenism. If you have a look on the chart there, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras met in Jerusalem in January of 1964. And then on the 21st of November, and it's there on the chart that you have, Vatican II promulgated 3 very important documents. Its dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, its decree on ecumenism, Unitatis Redintegratio, and its decree on the Catholic Eastern Churches, Orientalium Ecclesiarum. Those 3 documents actually form a closely related trio. And what followed for 15 years after that was what's often called the dialogue of charity between Catholics and Orthodox, getting to know and love one another again after such a long estrangement. And then after 15 years, in 1979, Pope John Paul II and Ecumenical Patriarch Demetrios announced the start of the theological dialogue, the so-called dialogue of truth, which necessarily relies on a continuing dialogue of charity. And that theological dialogue made strong progress through the 1980s. It hit severe difficulties, however, around 1990 with the fall of communism. A new freedom of religion allowed many members of those Catholic Eastern churches, often brutally repressed under the Soviet Empire, to reassert their Catholic identity, thus raising again the thorny issue of uniatism, namely the existence of Eastern churches in communion with Rome. Orthodox delegates in the dialogue insisted that that issue be moved to the very top of the agenda, and a statement on uniatism, firmly calling it the method of union of the past and contrasting it with the present search for full communion, was agreed in 1993. Again, you'll see on your chart, in Balamand in Lebanon, 1993. But even that did not clear the air. A very unproductive meeting was subsequently held in Baltimore in the year 2000, and then the dialogue simply came to a halt. Happily, it resumed in 2005, largely because of some significant gestures of charity in the meantime by Pope John Paul. And the newly reconstituted International Dialogue held its first plenary meeting at Belgrade in 2006. And it's worth noting that we were welcomed to Serbia, not only by the Serbian Orthodox Church, but by the civil authorities also. Both the Prime Minister and the President of Serbia hosted dinners for us. Why? Well, the Prime Minister said this: the churches of East and West are setting an extraordinary example by means of their dialogue. There is no alternative to dialogue, he said, if confronted peoples and communities are to achieve peace, confidence, solidarity, and cooperation. End of quote. You see, the fact is that the world warms to the very witness of dialogue. Even before the full communion that we hope for and pray for, Our very dialogue itself is a work of God's grace and a sign of peace. Cardinal Walter Casper, the former president of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, once said that in the 20th century, which was horribly marked by war and innocent suffering, ecumenism and the whole ecumenical movement was, and I quote, a light shining in the darkness and a powerful peace movement, end of quote. When the formal theological dialogue began between Catholics and Orthodox in 1980, a plan was agreed, and again, it's on your chart there, 1980. And it specified very wisely that the dialogue should begin with the elements that unite the Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. And if you just trace through on your chart, there were duly statements in 1982 on Eucharist, Church, and Trinity, 1987 on faith, sacraments, and ecclesial unity, and 1988 on ordination and apostolic succession. Those documents, as you can see, swiftly followed in a rapid succession, a blessed reminder of how much Catholics and Orthodox share and hold in common. And there's a pattern in that particular sequence of topics, and this is what I'd like just to focus on. A trajectory, you might say, was being followed. You see, as we've said, Catholics and Orthodox want to share the Eucharist together again. And the 1980 plan said very frankly that the purpose of our dialogue is the re-establishment of full communion, which will find its expression in the common celebration of the Holy Eucharist. So you might say, if that's our goal, first and foremost, we have to agree on what the Eucharist actually is. Well, that was the purpose of the first document in 1982. And then there are various conditions that are necessary for participating in the Eucharist, especially baptism and unity in faith. And that's what the second document of 1987 was dealing with. And then also, of course, the celebration of the Eucharist requires ministers, bishops, and priests properly ordained in apostolic succession. And that's what the third document of 1988 dealt with. If you think of it, the proper celebration of the Eucharist by the bishop and his presbyters in each local church actually requires two kinds of communion, vertical and horizontal, as we might say, in time and in space. Apostolic succession expresses the communion of bishops vertically through time, through history. And synodality, or what Catholics normally call collegiality, expresses the communion between bishops across the world today, at this present moment, horizontally, so to speak. So a fourth document was planned, dealing with that final point, almost like the last piece of the jigsaw, you might say. The whole scheme was focused on preparing the ground for us to celebrate the Eucharist together again. And the communion that we need horizontally among us, communion, conciliarity, synodality for the celebration of the Eucharist, was the theme for that fourth planned document. A draft of that fourth document was prepared in 1990. But then, as we said a moment ago, the Iron Curtain fell and all the difficulties that I mentioned earlier began. And that draft was set to one side. It was that draft, duly revised, that eventually became the Ravenna document of 2007, when the dialogue started up again and gathered momentum. Ever since the dialogue began, it has been concerned to clarify what the Church's communion life should actually look like. The Ravenna document identified three levels in the life of the Church. It distinguished these: the local, the regional, and the universal level. The history and tradition of the Church, said that Ravenna document, shows that at each level, the communion life or synodality that is characteristic of the Church has had a focal point in one who is first, the protos, or head, kephale, and that's where primacy comes in. The bishop is the first, or the head, among his people in the local church. The metropolitan, or the patriarch, is the first, or the head, among the bishops at the regional level of the church's life. And there has also been, and ought to be, a first or a head in the universal church among the metropolitans and the patriarchs. I quote from the Ravenna document: primacy at all levels of the church, local, regional, and universal, is a practice firmly grounded in the canonical tradition of the church. But it must never be forgotten, said Ravenna, that primacy and conciliarity or synodality are mutually interdependent. There is leadership, yes, but there is shared responsibility, the one and the many necessarily bound together. Those two affirmations are really crucial achievements of the Ravenna document, and the Chieti document reiterates them, together with the idea of there being three levels in the church's life in the world: local, regional, and universal. Different understandings of synodality and primacy played a significant role in the divisions between Orthodox and Catholics, says the Chieti document. And that's why it's essential now to try and re-establish a common understanding of those realities. And that's exactly what the document sets out to do, with a particular focus, of course, on the universal level of the church, which is where our big questions arise, and a particular reference to the first millennium, the era that we hold in common before our division. It's important, and it's worth saying this, to note that it's fully agreed between us, Catholics and Orthodox, that there is, of course, only one candidate for the office of universal primate, namely the Bishop of Rome. Ravenna and Chieti both recognize that Rome has always been the first in the listing, or the taxis, as it's called, of the major sees in the church that took shape between the 4th and the 7th centuries. The formal listing of the major sees was Rome in the first place, then Constantinople in the second place, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem in that order. And Chieti reproduces all the relevant canons from the early church in a very long footnote. Rome exercised a primacy of honor, says Chieti, recalling a phrase that was used by the Council of Constantinople in 381. Interestingly, at no point does Chieti use the phrase first among equals that we often hear today, primus inter pares. Because the fact is that that phrase, first among equals, appears to have no patristic warrant at all. The patristic phrase is presiding in charity, having a primacy of honor. Those are the patristic phrases. The local Church of Rome presides in love, said St. Ignatius of Antioch. And Pope Francis often recalls those words. The Ravenna document itself used that phrase. And Ravenna ended up by saying that what was needed was for the role of the Bishop of Rome in the communion of all the churches to be studied in greater depth. In other words, what exactly does presiding in charity mean? Well, the Chieti document tried to give at least a start of an answer to that all-important question. You see, scholars have pointed out that properly understood, that phrase, having a primacy of honor, doesn't just mean having a sort of honorific primacy and having a certain place in processions or something like that. Far from it. It refers to very serious tasks and responsibilities that have to be carried out by the person who holds the first place, the primacy in the church. Chieti identifies various roles and responsibilities that the Bishop of Rome had in the first millennium. First of all, it refers to the fact that although the Bishop of Rome did not personally attend any of the ecumenical councils held in the first millennium, in each case, and I quote, he was either represented by his legates or he agreed with the council's conclusions post factum, after the fact. Chieti quotes the Seventh Ecumenical Council, namely the Second Council of Nicaea in the year 787, which gave the most detailed listing of criteria for a council to be recognized as an ecumenical council. And one of the conditions for that designation was that the council had, and I quote, the cooperation, synergeia, of the Bishop of Rome. So you see, there can't be an ecumenical council without the Bishop of Rome's involvement in some capacity, we might say. And that's one of the reasons why the recent Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church, again on your chart there, 2016, which was held, of course, without the participation of Pope Francis, made no claim to be an ecumenical council. It was a most important gathering of the Orthodox Church, but not an ecumenical council, strictly speaking. And then also, Chieti notes that the role that the Bishop of Rome played in the first millennium in receiving appeals from different parts of the church, both west and east, particularly from bishops who felt that they had been deposed unjustly. It notes the provisions of the Synod of Sardica, which was held in 343, very early, 343. That Synod of Sardica specified that if the Pope considered that an appeal that had come to him from a bishop in some part of the world was justified, the Bishop of Rome could order a retrial to be conducted by the bishops of the province neighboring the deposed bishop's own territory. In other words, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, could act to resolve the issue, but he couldn't just impose his own judgment. And that's why Chieti makes that very significant statement that we've already heard several times, namely that the Bishop of Rome did not exercise canonical authority over the churches of the East in the first millennium. The phrase isn't perfect because, in a sense, those canons of Sardica themselves constitute precisely a canonical authority. But I think the intention is clear. In later terminology, we might say that what the Chieti document is saying very plainly is that the Bishop of Rome did not exercise direct jurisdiction over the East in the first millennium. And we must accept that and work with that as we move forward. Now, those two specific responsibilities of the Bishop of Rome, recognized by the Chieti document, actually fit very closely with the teaching of Vatican II. In Lumen Gentium, the Council's dogmatic constitution on the Church, the Council said, and I quote, "There never is an ecumenical council which is not confirmed or at least recognized as such by Peter's successor," Lumen Gentium 22. And the Council's decree on ecumenism, Unitatis Redintegratio, said this: "For many centuries, the churches of the East and of the West went their own ways, though a brotherly communion of faith and sacramental life bound them together. If disagreements in faith and discipline arose among them, the Roman See acted by common consent as moderator." There's this kind of reference back to those decisions of the Synod of Sardica, a court of appeal, you might say. In my book, A Service of Love, which came out first in 2013 and then again in 2016, with a postscript to take account of the first years of Pope Francis, I outlined the very fascinating new thinking about the role of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, that has taken place on the Catholic side in the last 50 years or so, locating him not so much at the top of a pyramid, but rather at the heart of an ecclesiology of communion, a Eucharistic ecclesiology. You see the subtitle of the book, Papal Primacy, the Eucharist, and Church Unity. I suggested in this little book that the fundamental task of the Bishop of Rome is to serve the Eucharistic communion of the Church. Lumen Gentium 22 describes how Peter's successor, the Roman pontiff, and the bishops, successors of the apostles, are united with one another in a close collegial bond. And it recalls, and I quote, "the very ancient discipline whereby the bishops installed throughout the whole world lived in communion with one another and with the Roman pontiff in a bond of unity, charity, and peace." A bond of unity, charity, and peace. Now, when you think of it, unity, charity, and peace are all fruits of the Eucharist. Because there is one bread, said St. Paul to the Corinthians, we who are many are one body. There is one body and one spirit. So maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, said St. Paul to the Ephesians. By serving, we might say, in a whole multitude of ways, the Church's unity, charity, and peace, the Bishop of Rome can be said to be exercising what is fundamentally a Eucharistic responsibility, helping the Church to live out the Eucharistic ministry, or the Eucharistic mystery rather, at the heart of its life, in accordance with that famous principle I mentioned before, the Eucharist makes the Church. Very interestingly, if you think about it, those two papal tasks, the two tasks of the Bishop of Rome from ancient times, identified by Chieti and already previously mentioned by Vatican II, can themselves be fitted into that picture. Just remember the normal flow of the liturgy, the normal sequence of the Mass itself. Before we come to Holy Communion, there's a profession of faith, the Creed, and a sign of peace. Those are very significant preparatory moments, showing that those who ultimately receive the Eucharist together have to be right in their faith, as shown by saying the Creed together, and at peace with one another, shown by exchanging a sign of peace. Well, we might say, might we not, that ecumenical councils through the years have determined what is having a right faith. And dealing with appeals has been the instrument over the years for settling disputes and restoring peace. So if you see what I mean, by anchoring the Church's ecumenical councils on one hand and moderating disputes between bishops on the other hand, those are two very particular ways in which the Bishop of Rome can be said to be serving the Eucharistic unity of the whole Church in faith and communion. Councils keep us right in our faith. Appeals and peacemaking in the Church keep us in peaceful communion with one another. By their very nature, those two tasks of presiding at ecumenical councils or hearing appeals from bishops around the world are only occasional. But you might say that what abides is the role of the Bishop of Rome in symbolizing, serving, and strengthening the Church's Eucharistic unity in faith and communion. That, you might say, is the Bishop of Rome's abiding, daily, continual responsibility, exercised in a whole multitude of ways. And lest you're wondering how all of this might fit with Vatican I, which everyone naturally recalls when we think of Catholic teaching about the papacy, and also tends to get rather worried about in an ecumenical setting, how are we going to deal with Vatican I? Well, let me say that there are good reasons to be positive, because Vatican I actually taught that papal primacy exists, and I quote, so that the episcopate itself might be one and undivided, and that the whole multitude of believers might be preserved in faith and communion by a closely united priesthood. That's a quote from the document Pastor Aeternus of Vatican I. Notice the key words in that statement: communion, priesthood. The Eucharistic resonances are very clear. Now, yes, the dominant language and perspective of Vatican I was juridical, but that's clearly not the whole story. Vatican I's documents deserve revisiting and rereading. I would suggest that a Eucharistic understanding of the papacy is perfectly compatible not only with the teaching of Vatican II, but also actually with the teaching of Vatican I. And in fact, it goes all the way back to the scriptures and to the fathers of the Church. Coming back to our context here, one of the great benefits of a Eucharistic approach to the role of the Bishop of Rome, in line with the early Church, is that it opens new doors for dialogue between Catholics and Orthodox on this highly contentious issue. Let's recall that the split between Christians West and East, 1054, occurred at the very time when the West was developing a different, primarily juridical understanding of the papacy, positioned at the top of an institutional pyramid rather than at the heart of a Eucharistic communion. The fact that the split between us occurred as that pyramidal understanding was developing in the West is no coincidence. Ever since it began, as we saw earlier, Catholic Orthodox dialogue has aimed at restoring full communion so that Catholics and Orthodox can share the Eucharist together once again. The whole trajectory of the dialogue has been Eucharistic. The 1980 plan crucially said that when discussing differences between us, a distinction has to be made between those which are compatible with Eucharistic communion and those which are incompatible. The best possible way forward with regard to the primacy of the Bishop of Rome would be surely to see it as a ministry at the service of the Eucharistic communion of the Church, West and East. And so let's ask finally whether the Chieti document has any openings towards a Eucharistic understanding of the Bishop of Rome. We've seen already how it links the Bishop of Rome to the holding of ecumenical councils and to receiving appeals, both of which can be fitted into a Eucharistic picture. But does Chieti say anything more directly Eucharistic about the role of the Bishop of Rome? More explicitly Eucharistic, you might say. Well, yes, it does. Yes, it does. It says that taxis or ordering of the major sees, remember, Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, had its highest expression in the celebration of the Holy Eucharist. You see, the Eucharist is the highest expression of the Church, our bond of unity. And it's important to know who will preside at a Eucharistic liturgy when several primates are present, and how everyone should stand. What's the proper ordering of people? How are we going to conduct such a liturgy? They stand, says the Chieti document, in accordance with the taxis. And that practice, it says, manifested the Eucharistic character of their communion. And so you see, when we recall that the Bishop of Rome occupied the first place in that taxis, he was the first in that listing of the 5 major sees, we can certainly say that in a reunited Eucharistic celebration, there is no doubt that it would be the Bishop of Rome who presided over that Eucharist. The Chieti document is very clear on that. And we can certainly say, therefore, that Chieti is open to a Eucharistic understanding of the role and the ministry of the Bishop of Rome among his fellow primates, all of them standing within the communion of the people of God as a whole. As we've seen, such an understanding serves to unify the various tasks proper to the Bishop of Rome that Chieti identifies, and it fits very neatly within the Eucharistic understanding of the Church that has been guiding the international Catholic Orthodox dialogue since it began in 1980. Now, clearly, there is more work to be done, but this would seem to be potentially a very promising and consistent way for the dialogue to address the most difficult issue of all between us, namely this issue of universal primacy, the role of the Bishop of Rome. It seems fitting to close with some words of the Catholic theologian Jean Tillard. He was one of the initial architects of the Catholic Orthodox theological dialogue back in 1980 with the great Orthodox theologian John Zizioulas. In his famous book on the Bishop of Rome, that was its title, The Bishop of Rome, Tillard rather anticipated, we might say. This was 1983 when he wrote his book. He seems to have anticipated the way that the dialogue between our churches would want ultimately to deal with this office of the Bishop of Rome. The Church is not made by the papacy, he said. Let's be very frank. The Church is not made by the papacy. It's made by baptism, and it's made by the Eucharist. But here's the quote. The purpose of the papacy, he said, is to give the Eucharist its full dimensions. And so I'm going to stop there. And I look forward to the discussion that I hope we're going to have in just a few minutes when you have watched this video. So I'll say for now, bye-bye and see you soon.